Language is, as has been brought up in many talks throughout this conference already, one of our unique human capabilities. A lot of other animals have even quite sophisticated communication systems, but no other animal has any communication system, has a communication system that is close at all to the complexity of human language. Human languages, we have patterning at the level of sound and at multiple levels up to meaning that interact in complex ways to allow us to produce the complex sentences that we produce and to understand one another. We also have the capacity not just to communicate about danger or food or something in our immediate environment, but to talk about the past, to imagine the future, etc. So this is a remarkable capacity. When you think about the acquisition of language, most of you probably think about the experiences you've had with your own children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, etc. And so what you focus on, unless you're a researcher or in this field who has kind of interests I have, are the production capabilities. And you would have heard that little baby doing reduplicated babbling by 8 months or so, ba, 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 producing their first words by 10 to 12 months, if not earlier, combining words, da-da, car, by 18 months or so. These are all averages. There's a lot of variability in early language acquisition. And producing complex clauses and sentences by 2 to 3 years. So it unfolds quite rapidly given the complexity of what human language is. And this unfolds without, specific tutelage or teaching or anything like that. Comprehension begins much earlier. So we now know that babies are responding to their own names by 4.5 months. So needless to say, I was a little concerned when my youngest grandchild didn't receive a name till she was a month old. They respond to common words. They'll look at the appropriate picture when they hear some common words we now know as early as 6 months of age. And the steps in bilingual acquisition, babies who are growing up with 2 languages, are quite similar. So what I'm going to argue throughout this talk is that perception provides the point of entry into the native language. Well, you don't have to argue it. It's the first kind of information that babies get about their native language. And it progressively builds on the organization that's already in place. So we not only have an evolutionary capacity for acquiring human language, we also start experiencing it quite early. So the auditory signal is something that the fetus does have exposure to, and their mother's speech, of course, and the rhythmical properties of that. So the development of native speech perception begins not at birth, but even earlier. And so in an intricate dance between nature, our evolved capacities, and experience. So in this talk, I'm going to begin by just describing some facts about perceptual development, the initial sensitivities babies have for language, phonetic discrimination, that's speech sound discrimination that Lisa mentioned, and perceptual attunement, as she also mentioned, attuning to the properties of the native language. Then I'm going to go through some of the work we've done in trying to understand how these initial sensitivities come to be and how attunement takes place, and look at this from a number of different perspectives. And in all cases, relating this to milestones in language acquisition, with a particular focus in this talk on word learning. We're going to look at babies from birth, actually a little bit of work on babies in utero as well, to about 2 years old. And I'll touch on some of the work we've done with babies growing up bilingual and those born premature. And where did I put my water bottle? Hang on a second. Okay. So some of the initial sensitivities, and this is just a tiny fraction of what we now know about the preparation for language in the newborn brain. The newborn brain is differentially, or the newborn is differentially responsive to speech versus various kinds of comparisons of non-speech with activation in the classic language areas. So if I were to show you an anatomical view of the newborn brain, you'd see that a lot of the structures and pathways are already in place at birth. Even in babies born premature, we see this several weeks before birth. So the structure is there. Functionally, babies are responsive, more responsive to speech than to non-speech. And this is both to the familiar language, the language they heard in utero, as well as to a language they haven't heard before. The brain is more responsive to that than to non-speech. But again, there's a differential signal for the language that was heard in utero. So they're more responsive. They've already started learning about the language that they heard in utero. And importantly, for a lot of what I'll talk about in the rest of the talk, there's a unique signature for phonetic discrimination. So in a newborn brain, now we know as young as 28 weeks gestation, there are particular circuits that are close to those used in the adult brain for discriminating speech-sound contrast. And a lot of this work has come from Ghislaine Hahn's lab in Paris. Behaviorally, babies will change their behavior to hear speech. So you can condition the sucking reflex, and babies will suck more on a pacifier to listen to speech over non-speech. But again, they prefer the language that they heard in utero, or the languages, if they were exposed to 2 languages in utero, their mom was bilingual, over an unfamiliar language. And in terms of phonetic discrimination, we've known since the classic work of Peter Imus, Peter Jusic, et cetera, from 1971, that young infants discriminate speech sounds in a categorical-like fashion. So basically, if you give them 2 sounds that are equally acoustically different, they do better at discriminating them if those distinctions cross rather than come from within a phonetic category. So the brain is prepared structurally and functionally at birth for processing human language. In terms of phonetic discrimination, I'll just go quickly through some of what Alyssa reviewed. I mean, this is a Lifetime Achievement Award, so you're like, I'm kind of old and I have to show you work from a long time ago. This is a distinction that's one of the ones that I've studied across my life, my career, so I'm just going to let you hear this. In English, we have only 6 stop consonants, ba, da, ga, pa, ta, ka, that's it. Hindi has 16, a very rich consonant system, and some of these, there's a distinction between a dental da, produced with the tongue at the back of the teeth, and a retroflex da, produced with the tip of the tongue at the roof of the mouth. You didn't hear that difference probably in my speech, although you might have, and here you hear it by a Hindi speaker. Okay, it's not working, but that's okay. That's what I just said, da, da. That is difficult for English adults to discriminate. That's how well you do, not very well. Hindi adults, it's a piece of cake. And babies who are 6 to 8 months of age, have English learning babies who haven't heard this before, have no trouble discriminating this either. So that's one demonstration of the capacity Lissa mentioned for babies to discriminate sound distinctions that might be used across any of the world's languages. And this is a capacity they have without specific experience with those sounds. And as Lissa also mentioned, this attunes in the first year of life. So an English learning baby of 6 to 8 months of age can discriminate that distinction. They're not doing as well by 8 to 10 months. And by 10 to 12 months of age, they're not doing well at all. Whereas a baby growing up with Hindi maintains, and we now know from subsequent work, and even sharpens their capacity to discriminate those native distinctions. We showed this initially with this conditioned head turn procedure where babies turn their head when they detect a sound change and get rewarded with a little toy animal. But it's been replicated many times. These are just some of the replications with other behavioral tasks and with various neural tasks as well. So I like to think about perceptual development in the language system then as involving attunement or narrowing. And so basically at birth, a baby is prepared to learn any of the world's languages with already a little bit of specialization for the language heard in utero. By 5 months of age, 6 months of age, they're showing stronger preference and some attunement, like for vowels, for the rhythmical properties, to the native language. And by 12 months, they've become real experts at the native language. So it's not that they have completely closed by this period their capacity to learn the properties of another language, but it's closing. And it will close completely for some particularly difficult distinctions thereafter. Now, this kind of perceptual attunement in infancy has consequences for later language acquisition. So this is work from Pat Kuhl's lab that shows that babies who are better at discriminating native speech sound contrasts in the first year of life and worse at non-native ones are going to go on to have a bigger vocabulary by 2 years of age. And in a long series of studies that kind of culminated in this one, we've shown that this is because after they go through this décollage, they come back and use their phonological categories to guide word learning. So what they've learned about the use of speech in the native language is something that they can use to guide word learning. So what you see in this particular slide is this is a distinction, a vowel length distinction that's used to distinguish meaning in Dutch, but not in English. So tam and tam would mean something different in Dutch, but not in English. And by 18 to 20 months, a baby who's growing up in the Netherlands can use that distinction to attach a different meaning to each of these objects, to map these words to 2 different objects and detect that, whoa, that was misnamed in the switch, in the testing phase of the study, whereas a baby growing up in English, Canadian English in this case, can no longer can't use that to guide word learning. So the phonological categories established in the first year, year and a half of age, eventually guide word learning. So that's why you see that kind of correlation. So that's just saying that perceptual development has an impact on later language acquisition. Okay, let's turn now to critical periods. So a lot of the work that I've done, as Alyssa mentioned, and influenced by you, I might point out, has asked whether there are critical or sensitive periods in perceptual development where the brain might be open to experience. And I've done a lot of work of this work, as Alyssa mentioned, with Takao Hinch, who's a neuroscientist at Harvard, and that's just a picture of us at a conference in Sicily a couple of summers ago. But this work is very collaborative and builds on some really elegant work that he's done. So basically, why do I talk about critical periods? We used to talk about those in developmental psychology, then we stopped talking about them, and everybody said, oh no, they're just sensitive periods because you can change the timing of change, and sometimes you can reopen them, and there's plasticity throughout the lifespan. Yeah, but that's not that helpful. And what Takao's work has done has provided a mechanistic model of what a critical period is and how and when you might be able to, and under what circumstances, change the timing. That's helpful. So basically, the notion of a critical period is a window. Whoops, sorry. We're going the wrong way now. Which one goes back? Not that one. That one. Okay. is a window in development when whatever system you're studying, there are multiple critical periods in language acquisition, a window in development when a particular system is most open to experience. Now, what we've learned is that the brain wants to learn all the time. So it's trying to learn. It's plastic. It wants to be plastic. But there are active, that takes a lot of energy consumption. There are active processes that dampen that plasticity. So there are molecular brakes that are thrown down or put down prior to the opening of plasticity. And the lifting of these is maturationally determined. And there are molecular brakes that are placed, again, following a period of plasticity, a different set of molecular brakes in some cases, which dampens again or closes off plasticity. And the timing of the second set of brakes relies on both maturation and experience. So even these sort of molecular processes that open and close plasticity show this dance between nature and nurture. And so what Takao has shown in his work is that the opening and closing of plasticity is gated by the relative proportion of inhibition to excitation, and in the sensory systems, it's in a particular set of interneurons, parvalbumin cells. But by knowing this and knowing the pathways and the molecules that get into these pathways to gate plasticity, he's shown in a number of beautiful studies, as have other people now, using this model with mice and rats and other animals, that you can, and with humans as well, that you can change the timing of plasticity by pharmacological manipulations, by using knockout mice, by really engaging experience, et cetera. So together, we've, when in some cases, some of the work I've done separately, we've tried to understand whether the periods of sensitivity and speech perception development are critical period-like. So first of all, in work that I did in collaboration with Marcela Pina and Ghislaine Dehaene, we showed that sensitivity to experience is gated by maturation. So we looked at babies who were born up to 3 months premature. And so what that means is they had earlier exposure to broadcast speech, which has a lot more information about consonants than the speech you hear in utero. And we asked whether this earlier experience would accelerate the timing of change, the loss of discrimination of the non-native Hindi distinction that I introduced you to. And basically what we found is that it didn't. So even though they had had earlier experience to broadcast speech, babies' brains had to reach the maturational milestone that would allow them, or the maturational stage that would allow them to learn from the experience of the environment, so that they weren't, rather than attuning to the native speech sound categories at 10 to 12 months of age, for a baby born 3 months premature, this happened 3 months later. But on the other hand, exposure can change critical period timing. And Lissa mentioned some of this as well. So as she mentioned, babies who are exposed to, so depression is a physiological consequence of pregnancy for a lot of us. And so it's, it's something that we as a society have to try to understand. And one approach to depression is to take serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Now these get into the same circuits, those parvalbumin cells, through a secondary pathway that I showed to you. And moms who take antidepressants during their pregnancies, the timing of the change in speech perception development is accelerated. So basically, they stop discriminating non-native distinctions at an earlier age. And in fact, even in utero, we tested them at 36 weeks gestation in utero using, this is with Tim Oberlander as well, using fetal heart rate as a measure of discrimination. And what we found is there was acceleration in some aspects of consonant discrimination in those babies who were exposed to serotonin in utero. Now, is this a good thing, acceleration? As Lynn pointed out in his talk yesterday, acceleration in development is often not a good thing because many systems have to develop together. So if a baby, for example, is closing off their discrimination sensitivities prior to enough experience with the native language, they might not have those phonological categories in place that optimally guide word learning. We've been trying to follow these babies up for years, and finally, now that they're turning 10 years old, we have the funding in place, and we're looking at their phonological categories at age 10 to see if this has a lasting consequence, this acceleration in timing. But not taking serotonin reuptake inhibitors is not necessarily the answer either, because moms who are depressed during pregnancy and choose to not have a pharmacological manipulation, there's also an impact on development. And in this case, timing is later. And so babies are continuing to discriminate the non-native speech sound contrasts for a longer period of time than those babies whose moms are not depressed. Now, again, we think delay, that's not a good thing. It might be okay. Because if, again, the whole system is developing more slowly, we know that the speech from depressed moms is not as engaging and there's not as much joint attention, et cetera. So it may be that the system is developing in a way that allows the input that the baby is receiving to work. We don't know. We have these babies in our sample now at 10 years of age as well. So hopefully we'll learn. So the system may be protective, it may not. I mentioned that. Okay, let's look at the mechanisms of attunement. If you think about a baby growing up in a Hindi environment versus a baby growing up in an English environment, there are, and again, let's use this retroflex dental distinction, there are at least two differences in the way that they're experiencing speech. So on the one hand, a baby growing up with Hindi is hearing those two different words in different contexts, so linked to two different objects. So it turns out that the dental dal means lentils. You guys all know that. You order dal, but you say it with your English D, which is in between these two. Whereas dal with a retroflex D means branch in Hindi, not in a lot of other South Asian languages, but it does in Hindi. So a baby growing up in Hindi hears these sounds in two different contexts, but they also hear a different statistical distribution of these sounds. So sometimes the dental, in English, babies hear primarily this alveolar da. We put our tongue on the alveolar ridge when we produce it. But sometimes it moves forward. If we say with dogs, our tongue is at the back of our teeth. And if we say our dog, our tongue is pulled back a bit. But the modal D that English babies hear is centered around a single category. Whereas for a baby growing up in Hindi, there are two different distributions. So they hear a center around a frontal D and a center around a retroflex D. And as Alyssa mentioned, we've tested whether babies are sensitive to to both of these properties, but let's start with the statistical properties. So in work that Jessica May brought to my lab, having come from Luann Gherkin's lab, we asked whether babies are sensitive to statistical distributions. So basically what we did, first of all with another distinction, and then also with this retroflex dental distinction, is we created a continuum of sounds that go, let's say, from dental to retroflex, lots of different steps along the way, and then we created a set of these that we familiarized babies to, such that there were more instances of either the two modes to make it like Hindi exposure, or a single mode to make it like English exposure. But of course, we didn't present them in order. They were all randomly presented, and so they hear da, 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 etc. And then we tested them on their discrimination. And what we found is that babies who had been in the bimodal familiarization condition were better able at discriminating the endpoints following distributional learning than were those babies who had been in the unimodal condition. This seems to be sensitive period-like, so distributional learning is quite effective at 6 to 8 months. It's less so at 10 to 12 months. By 14 months or so, work from Kager's lab as well as from our lab indicates, in Jessica May's subsequent work, that it's really, really hard to change categories with distributional learning after that age. You get a little bit of a change in adults, but they stay below chance performance. We've also tested whether the mapping of these two different sounds to two different objects facilitates discrimination. And what we find is by the time babies are 9 to 10 months of age, and this is work that Henny Jung brought to my lab, you'll see his picture later, that at around, distributional learning isn't working, this is still working. So if babies hear a dental DAW regularly with one object and a retroflex DAW regularly with another object, they're better able to discriminate at this point in time when sensitivity is otherwise declining than they are if they hear this the same number of times and see the objects the same number of times, but without the consistent pairing. And in subsequent work that Henny did in the lab, he looked at tone distinctions. Now, so tone distinctions, like used in Chinese, are something that we hear all the time, even growing up in English. But they're not used to contrast the meaning of two different words. They have more to do with what we call indexical properties, so maybe emphasis in speech. So babies have to, they hear those, but they have to learn not to use them for word meaning, lexical contrast. And what Henny found is that when you test them on something like tones, and he also did this on stress with Thierry Nazi, is that this simple pairing isn't enough. Babies need to know that this is about word learning. And if you give them some cues that this is about word learning, then they can use tone to pull it apart. And they're like, oh, maybe tone is used in my language. So I don't know if that was clear or not. Okay, multisensory processing. I'm going to turn to that for the last little bit. Infants experience speech in a multisensory context. That's first grandchild. So they don't just hear you, they also see your face, feel the rhythm of what you're saying, and try to imitate what they see. So I don't think I have time to show you this. But I'll just will for 1 second. So for those of you who haven't seen the McGurk effect, I don't know if sound is working. It's not. Okay. So basically, when you watch that guy speaking, you probably think you're hearing a va. If you closed your eyes, you would hear a ba, because a ba has been dubbed onto that. So even in adults, visual speech influences what you hear. You all know this when you're at a noisy party, you watch somebody's face, and that helps you understand their speech. Babies also show sensitivity to the visual cues in speech. They show the McGurk effect. They also do bimodal matching. So if they see two spaces side by side, one producing an E and one producing an oo, for example, or an ah, and they hear one of the sounds, they'll look at the side that matches what they hear. This attunes. They stop doing this by 10 months of age for non-native distinctions. And they really are doing this on the basis not just of what they hear, but also what they see. Babies are also sensitive to the visual information alone in talking speech. So we asked in this work whether babies could discriminate one language from another just by watching silent talking faces. So you've ever been in a place where you just can't find an English speaker and you're helplessly lost? If you look around and watch them, even if it's noisy, cacophonous railroad station, like I once experienced in Tokyo, if you look around at the faces, you'll be able to tell who's speaking English a little bit. Not very well, but a little bit. So the way that we tested this is we showed babies videos of bilingual speakers speaking just one at a time, speaking either English or French, but with the sound turned off. So which side do you think the French is on? How many of you think it's on your right? How many of you think it's on your left? Yeah, that's about how well English speakers do. You get about 65% correct. Not great, but a little bit better than chance. Babies are really good at this. It was the right, by the way, I think. Is that right? Yeah. Babies are really good at this at 4 months and at 6 months. By 8 months, they're not good at this anymore, unless they're growing up bilingual with French and English, or even just bilingual in general. So this visual-only attunement to the properties of the native language is also changed by depression and SRI. So again, exposure to SRIs in utero accelerates the timing of change, and depression without pharmacological treatment delays the timing of change. So we think this might be critical period-like as well. And visual information is used even by infants. So this is some work we recently did, which basically, if babies hear, if they see two different objects, as you can see there, that are each labeled, but don't actually see the face during the training procedure. So this is labeled cage, this is labeled rouge, and then are tested on that. They recognize the match, they learn the word when tested in the same modality. So they hear cage, they'll look to the correct side in the test phase. But they also do this cross-modally. So after having been taught that the word cage goes with one object, the word rouge goes with another one, and then the sound, there's no sound, and they just see somebody saying, they'll look at the correct object. So they can do auditory to visual transfer. They can't do visual to auditory for many years. So as I mentioned, babies see your talking face, and they also attempt to imitate the movements that they see. So we've been asking, is speech perception development a two-legged stool, auditory visual, or is it a three-legged stool? Are they using their own motor movements to drive speech perception development as well? So very quickly, the common view of multisensory integration is that these develop independently and come together later in development. Why do I have oral motor down here way before birth when we know babbling, canonical babbling, isn't until about 10 months? Because babies are actually making tongue movements in utero before the auditory system is developing, and they need to do this so that by the time they're born, that they can swallow and vocalize without suffocating. So tongue movements and oral motor movements are one of the first, and the feedback, the tactile and somatic, and all the feedback from that is one of the earliest experiences babies have perceptually. So the common view is these develop independently, come together through learning, through synchrony, whatever, later in development. An alternative account is one that would have been proposed by Schnierle decades ago, or Gottlieb, or Turkowitz, that they develop sequentially, with the first developing system, in this case the tongue movements, laying down a template that the next developing system, in this case audition, can build on, and then the one that becomes available at birth, vision, can build on as well. And we've been testing this. First of all, you know that there's articulatory influences on speech perception in adults. Jung brought to my lab the question of whether there are also articulatory influences on speech perception in babies. So he did this with bimodal matching. So babies see U and E, and they hear one or the other, they match. If you put something in their mouth that either stretches their lips into an E configuration or purses them into an U configuration, you disrupt this matching. So they can do it when it doesn't match with their hearing, but if it matches, you disrupt this ability. So then Alison Bruderer came along and said, well, is this only for visually mediated speech? They've been seeing what they're hearing, and by 6 months, babies are 4 months, the age that Henny tested them, they're probably already producing vowels, but they're not producing consonants yet in babbling, well-formed ones. And so she decided to test them on non-native, this retroflex dental distinction. That's the tongue placement for producing this. And so using the method that Henny had introduced to the lab, she either had mom place a flat teether in the baby's mouth over the tongue that prevented tongue movements, so that they wouldn't be able to. They can't produce this yet, but are they trying to imitate? Or a gummy teether that sat on their gums but didn't interfere with tongue movements, and tested their discrimination. That was just ultrasound confirmation that the teether either does or does not interfere with the tongue movement. And basically what she found is that without a teether, babies can discriminate this dental retroflex distinction, da-da. With the gummy teether, these are babies who are 6 months old, they can discriminate this distinction. So yeah, they're universal listeners. But if you put this flat teether in their mouth that prevents tongue movement, discrimination is disrupted. Now, this was a little bit of a surprising finding. So the kind of finding that requires pre-registered replication. So Sherry Choi has done that in my lab now. We pre-registered this with Psychonomic Bulletin and Review, and we replicated the original finding with the flat teether disrupting discrimination, and we also showed that the gummy teether that sits on the lips, which sits on the gums, that doesn't interfere with tongue tip movement, but does interfere with lip closure, so for like a bilabial ba, that it disrupts discrimination of the ba-da. So there's specificity in the relation between the articulatory movement that is disrupted, the one that's related to the speech sound that babies will be hearing. So what we think this shows is evidence consistent with the notion that the initial speech perception representations that babies have by birth or early in life are already multisensory in character, that they don't have to learn the associations between what they hear, see, and feel. Okay, I just want to end. Let me, a little drink. by mentioning a new line of work that we're now doing. Babies experience speech, yes, in interaction, but they also experience speech in a broader culture and context. So a baby, lots of our babies in Vancouver are bilingual. As I mentioned, we do a lot of work on that. I'm barely talking about it in this talk. And a baby who's growing up bilingual, depending upon the home environment, may experience each of their languages in a different cultural context. So there will be the ethnicity of the faces might be different. There may be other cues as well, other cultural cues. There's some work that's suggested that ethnicity and language might have a privileged kind of link, so that's where we started looking at this relation. And we're asking whether these babies are paying attention to these other cultural cues and using those to help them separate their languages and to guide then acquisition. So we've just made a little headway here. First of all, in a paper that's either out or just coming out or online in developmental psychobiology, Lily May in my lab showed that by 11 months, Vancouver babies, where we have a very large Southeast Asian population, lots of Chinese speakers, by this age, others have shown that babies pair familiar with familiar and unfamiliar with unfamiliar. But in Vancouver, by 11 months, our children know that only ethnic Chinese speakers are likely to be speaking Chinese, that Caucasian speakers are not. And they also will accept English from ethnic Chinese speakers because that's what they've experienced as well. But they know that Chinese will be exclusively coming from them. So that's kind of cool. And in some other work that Shenfu Hu has led, we've also found that babies who are growing up bilingual with a Chinese language, Mandarin or Cantonese, and English, if they're first shown the face of somebody who's ethnically Chinese, and then given a speech sound discrimination task for a contrast that's only used in one of those Chinese languages and not in English, they do a better job of discriminating it than if they're first shown a Caucasian face. So they can discriminate in both cases. They're bilingual. This is at 10 months of age. But they do a better job when they see first a Chinese face. So we think that our babies are incredibly sophisticated. Okay, so I hope that I've convinced you that the initial sensitivities babies have are attuned to the properties of the native language through a number of different ways, that this sets the stage for language acquisition. It has implications, of course, for a typically developing child. Also has implications for a child who has hearing difficulties. We know that these steps are delayed, and it seems to have the biggest impact on using phonological categories to drive word learning if there isn't a cochlear implant within the first year or two of life. The work, I hope, has suggested that this may also have implications for a baby with visual difficulties or a baby with oral motor difficulties. And that's the end. I want to thank you for listening.